When the lawyer slid the heavy rusted brass key across the mahogany table, my greedy relatives scoffed. They inherited the real estate and the millions. I got scrap metal. But the attached coordinates didn't lead to a junk drawer. They pointed to a classified Cold War bunker and my family's darkest secret. The rain in Seattle hasn't stopped for 3 days, casting a permanent, oppressive twilight over the city. It felt entirely appropriate for the occasion. We were gathered in the expansive glass-walled conference room of Finch and Associates, high above the slick grey streets. My grandfather, General Thomas Hargrove, was dead at 92. He was a man forged in the paranoia of the Cold War, a logistics and intelligence officer whose career was buried beneath layers of black ink and redacted files. To the world, he was a decorated patriot. To my Aunt Beatrice and cousin Leo, he was a walking bank vault. To me, he was a silent, imposing figure who used to teach me Morse code instead of throwing a baseball, a man who showed affection through rigorous discipline. I was the family outlier, an architectural historian barely scraping by on freelance grants, entirely out of place among the hedge fund managers and real estate developers that made up the rest of the Hargrove bloodline. Gregory Finch, an 80-year-old attorney whose skin looked like dry parchment, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the tense silence of the room. He adjusted his spectacles, his trembling hands shuffling the thick, cream-colored pages of my grandfather's last will and testament. "We come to the final disbursements," Mr. Finch murmured, his voice barely louder than the rain lashing against the windows. Beatrice leaned forward, the diamonds on her tennis bracelet clinking against the mahogany table. She had already secured the Bellevue estate and a hefty portion of the liquid assets. Leo, sitting beside her with a smug, self-satisfied grin, had just been named the primary beneficiary of my grandfather's extensive stock portfolio. They had won. They had carved up the empire. "To my grandson, Daniel Hargrove," Finch read, pausing to peer over his glasses at me. "I leave the sum total of my physical past and the burden of the truth." Beatrice let out a short, derisive snort. "Typical Thomas," she whispered loudly to Leo, "always with the theatrical nonsense." Mr. Finch ignored her. He reached beneath the table and produced a small, battered wooden box. It looked like an old ammunition crate, scaled down, the olive-drab paint chipping away to reveal scarred pine. He slid it across the polished wood. It stopped exactly in front of me. "Mr. Hargrove was very specific, Daniel," Finch said, his tone shifting from professional to intensely personal. "He instructed me to give this to you, and only you. Furthermore, he mandated that you are not to open it until you are completely alone." "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Beatrice snapped, her patience finally expiring. "What is it, Gregory? Some old war medals? Let the boy open it. We have estate taxes to discuss." "I am bound by the terms of the document, Beatrice," Finch replied coldly. "Daniel, you may take the box. That concludes the reading." I didn't wait around for the post-mortem gloating. I grabbed the box, feeling an unexpected weight to it, and walked out of the glass-paneled room without a word. I took the elevator down to the parking garage, sitting in the damp chill of my 10-year-old Subaru. For a long time, I just stared at the wooden lid. The brass latch was tarnished, green with age. My heart hammered against my ribs. My grandfather never did anything without a calculated reason. If he left me out of the financial windfall to give me this, it wasn't a sentimental gesture. It was a mission. I flicked the latch and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of rotting black velvet, was a key. It was massive, made of heavy brass, with a complex, jagged teeth pattern that looked more like it belonged to a medieval fortress than a modern door. Attached to the key by a rusted chain was a heavily worn military dog tag. I held the tag up to the dim dome light of my car. Stamped into the metal wasn't my grandfather's name or rank. It was a set of geographic coordinates: 46.2754 degrees north, 123.9871 degrees west. Below the numbers was a single stamped word: Bunker 414. Beneath the velvet in the box lay a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was my grandfather's, sharp, aggressive, and perfectly slanted. Daniel, they think I built my fortune on smart investments. They are fools. Everything we have, everything this family is, started in the dark. The military decommissioned 414 in 1982, but I never gave it back. I bought the land through a shell corporation. The truth about Operation Whisper is down there. Do not trust Finch. Do not tell your aunt. Go alone. The key turns counterclockwise, twice. Bring a weapon. Grandpa Thomas. I read the note 3 times. A chill, entirely unrelated to the Seattle weather, crept up my spine. Bring a weapon. Thomas Hargrove was not a man prone to exaggeration. If he said I needed a weapon, it meant he expected someone, or something, to be waiting. I pulled out my phone and punched the coordinates into the GPS. The map zoomed out, then zeroed in on a desolate, heavily forested peninsula near the mouth of the Columbia River, right on the border of Washington and Oregon. It was a rugged, unforgiving stretch of coastline, miles away from any major highway, choked by ancient Sitka spruce trees and relentless coastal fog. I looked at the brass key resting in my palm. The metal was freezing. I was a historian. I spent my days in climate-controlled archives looking at blueprints of old Victorian homes. I didn't own a gun. I had never been in a fight in my life, but as I sat there in the parking garage, listening to the rain, a strange, inherited stubbornness settled over me. Thomas had chosen me because he knew Beatrice and Leo would just sell the land without ever looking beneath the dirt. He knew I was curious. I started the engine, threw the car into drive, and headed south toward the coast. The drive took 4 hours, but the final 3 miles took almost 2. I had to abandon my Subaru on a washed-out logging road miles from the actual coordinates. The Pacific Northwest forest swallowed me whole the moment I stepped out of the vehicle. The canopy of moss-draped pines was so thick it blocked out the midday sun, casting the woods in an eerie, emerald gloom. The rain had turned the forest floor into a treacherous sponge of mud, decaying ferns, and hidden, slippery roots. I had stopped at a hardware store in Astoria and bought a heavy Maglite flashlight, a crowbar, and, honoring my grandfather's ominous advice, a heavy steel hunting knife that sat awkwardly on my belt. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shifting shadow in the ferns made my pulse spike. According to my handheld GPS, I was standing directly on top of the coordinates. But there was nothing here, just a sheer, muddy embankment covered in a dense thicket of blackberry brambles. Frustration bubbled up in my chest. Had Thomas gone senile at the end? Was this a wild goose chase designed to punish me for not joining the military? I kicked violently at the embankment, my boot tearing through the thick vines. There was a dull, metallic thud. It wasn't a rock. I froze, my breath pluming in the damp air. I dropped to my knees and started tearing at the thorny blackberry bushes with my leather gloves. The thorns bit through the material, scratching my skin, but I didn't stop. I cleared a patch of earth and moss, revealing a slab of dark, rivet-studded steel. It took me another hour of exhausting, back-breaking labor to clear the facade. When I was done, I stood back, panting, staring at an impossibility. Built directly into the side of the coastal hill, heavily camouflaged by decades of overgrowth, was a massive, reinforced blast door. It was painted a faded, peeling olive drab, matching the box the key came in. Faint yellow stenciling across the center, barely visible through the rust, read, "Restricted access. Sector 4, 1-4. To the right of the door was a heavy steel housing unit containing a single, oversized keyhole. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. My hands were shaking. I slid the key into the slot. It fit perfectly, sliding home with a satisfying, heavy metallic click. The key turns counterclockwise, twice. I gripped the cold brass and turned it to the left. The resistance was immense. Decades of rust and disuse fought against me. I had to wrap both hands around the key and throw my entire body weight into it. With a deafening, groaning screech that echoed through the silent forest, the internal tumblers shifted. One turn. I readjusted my grip, my palms sweating inside my torn gloves, and forced it around a second time. Clack! A pneumatic hiss violently released from the edges of the door, kicking up a cloud of ancient dust and dead leaves. The seal was broken. I wedged the crowbar into the seam and pried. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive steel door swung outward on its hinges, revealing a pitch-black void. A wave of air washed over me. I expected the suffocating stench of decay, but instead it smelled like ozone, dry paper, and gun oil. I clicked on my heavy maglite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a concrete tunnel that sloped sharply downward. I drew the hunting knife with my left hand, holding the flashlight high in my right, and stepped over the threshold. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment I was inside. The walls were lined with thick, rubber-coated cables and rusted fuse boxes. I walked down the tunnel for about 50 yards, until it opened up into a sprawling, subterranean room. My flashlight swept across the space, and my jaw dropped. It wasn't a dusty, forgotten ruin. It was a time capsule. Rows of olive-green filing cabinets lined the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive teak desk, flanked by complex, Cold War-era radio equipment and a clunky teleprinter. Maps of the Soviet Union and the Pacific coastline were pinned to corkboards, frozen in 1982. But as I walked closer to the desk, the hairs on my arms stood up. The air was too dry. The bunker had an automated dehumidification system, and I could hear the faint, low hum of a generator running somewhere deep in the bowels of the complex. My grandfather had maintained this place. It was fully powered. I reached the desk and shined my light on its surface. There was a vintage rotary phone, a brass lamp, and a heavy, leather-bound ledger sitting perfectly in the center. But it was what lay next to the ledger that made the blood freeze in my veins. A ceramic mug. Inside it was a half-empty pool of black coffee. I touched the side of the mug. It was still warm. I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly into the dark corners of the massive room. "Go alone. Bring a weapon." My grandfather hadn't been warning me about squatters or wild animals. I looked back down at the desk. I flipped open the heavy leather ledger. I expected to find military inventories, troop movements, or logistical supply codes. Instead, the pages were filled with columns of names. Some of the names I recognized instantly. Prominent politicians, wealthy CEOs, a famous federal judge. Next to each name was a date, and a string of numbers that looked exactly like offshore routing codes. I flipped to the very last page. The ink was fresh, entirely different from the faded blue ballpoint of the earlier entries. The handwriting wasn't my grandfather's rigid script. It was elegant, looping, and feminine. The last entry was dated yesterday. The name written on the line was Daniel Hargrove. Next to my name was a sum. $45 million. And next to that, a single word. Terminated. A sharp, metallic click echoed from the shadows behind me. It was the unmistakable sound of a revolver's hammer being pulled back. I told Thomas it was a mistake to involve you, Daniel, a voice said from the dark. I turned slowly. The beam of my flashlight caught the polished black leather of expensive shoes, moving upward past a tailored suit, finally resting on a face I had seen just 4 hours ago in the glass conference room. It was Gregory Finch, the 80-year-old lawyer, but he wasn't holding a cane, and his hands weren't trembling anymore. They were perfectly steady, gripping the handle of a silenced pistol aimed directly at my chest. My mind short-circuited. The man standing before me was supposed to be a relic, a paper pusher who spent his twilight years drafting trusts and estates for Seattle's elite. Yet, the Gregory Finch aiming a matte black heckler and Coke USP compact at my heart looked entirely in his element. The tremors in his hands were gone, replaced by the lethal stillness of a seasoned operator. "Mr. Finch," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding incredibly small in the cavernous, echoing bunker. "What is this?" "This is estate management, Daniel," Finch replied, his voice devoid of the raspy frailty he had affected in the conference room. He stepped fully into the beam of my maglite. He was wearing expensive leather gloves. "Your grandfather was a brilliant tactician, but his sentimentality in his final days was a liability. I couldn't allow a civilian, a historian no less, to inherit the keys to the kingdom." I kept the heavy maglite trained on his face, blinding him slightly, while my left hand subtly tightened around the rubber grip of the hunting knife hidden behind my leg. "The kingdom? You mean this ledger? Operation Whisper?" Finch let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Operation Whisper died the day the Berlin Wall fell. What your grandfather built from its ashes was far more lucrative. You see, when the Department of Defense officially decommissioned Sector 414, they left behind a state-of-the-art secure communications hub. Thomas and I realized that the world's most powerful people, executives at General Dynamics, managing directors at Credit Suisse, senators who needed offshore problems handled quietly, required a bank that didn't exist on any grid. He gestured vaguely with his free hand toward the banks of filing cabinets. "This bunker isn't a museum. It's a clearinghouse for international blackmail, unregulated defense contracts, and shadow banking. Thomas held the leverage. I managed the legal obfuscation. Together we built the fortune your Aunt Beatrice and cousin Leo are currently celebrating." "And the $45 million next to my name?" I asked, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my temples. "A necessary accounting error," Finch said smoothly. "With Thomas gone, the accounts need to be liquidated and transferred to my personal offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands. I needed a fall guy to initiate the final transfer, someone who the board would believe found the bunker and tried to steal the reserves. You were the perfect patsy, a disgruntled, disinherited grandson. Tomorrow the authorities will receive an anonymous tip about a body in an abandoned military installation. They will find you, an empty digital vault, and a tragic story of greed." He raised the pistol, aiming down the sights. "I'm sorry, Daniel, truly, but the architecture of this empire requires a sacrifice." Architecture. The word echoed in my mind, snapping me out of my paralyzing terror. Finch was a lawyer and a killer, but he was in my domain now. As an architectural historian, I had spent the last decade studying brutalist structures, Cold War military installations, and subterranean load-bearing designs. I knew exactly how these 1970s bunkers were wired. I knew their vulnerabilities. My eyes darted from the barrel of his gun to the wall directly behind him. Running along the damp concrete was a thick, exposed conduit pipe leading to a massive, rusted circuit breaker box, the central power junction for the automated dehumidifier, and the lighting grid. "Thomas told me to bring a weapon," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady timbre. Finch smirked. "A knife against a firearm. You're outmatched, son." I wasn't talking about the knife. I didn't lunge at him. Instead, I whipped my right arm backward and hurled the heavy metal maglite with every ounce of strength I possessed. I didn't aim for Finch. I aimed over his shoulder, directly at the rusted, brittle glass of the main circuit breaker panel. The heavy flashlight flew like a missile. Finch flinched, firing a suppressed shot that hissed past my ear, embedding itself into the teak desk. A microsecond later, the maglite slammed into the breaker box. Glass shattered. Sparks erupted in a blinding cascade of blue and white electrical fire. There was a deafening crack, followed by the sickening smell of burning ozone and melting copper. Instantly, the bunker plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The low hum of the generator died. "You fool!" Finch roared from the pitch black. I didn't wait. I dropped to the floor, rolling frantically to my left, just as two more suppressed shots thwipped through the space where my chest had been a second prior. The concrete chipped, spraying dust across my face. My heart pounded furiously, but my mind was crystal clear. Finch had the gun, but he was an 80-year-old man in total darkness. I was 40 years younger, running on pure adrenaline, and I had mapped the room's layout the moment I walked in. I crawled silently beneath the massive teak desk, gripping my hunting knife in my sweaty palm. I could hear Finch's heavy, measured breathing. I could hear the expensive leather of his shoes scuffing against the concrete floor as he pivoted, searching for me. "You can't hide in here, Daniel," Finch called out, his voice echoing off the curved walls, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. "There's only one way out. The vault door is sealed until power is restored. You've trapped us both." I held my breath. My hand brushed against the heavy leather ledger sitting on the desk above me. I grabbed it, waiting until Finch took another slow, calculated step. I tossed the heavy book hard into the far right corner of the room. It slammed into a metal filing cabinet with a loud crash. Finch reacted instantly. He fired 3 rapid shots into the corner, the muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness in violent, strobe-like bursts. In those fragmented flashes of light, I saw him, standing just 10 feet away, his back turned to the desk, his arm extended toward the noise. I didn't think. I just moved. I scrambled out from beneath the desk and lunged at him from behind. I didn't use the knife to stab him. I wasn't a killer. Instead, I tackled him around the waist, driving my shoulder directly into his lower back. Finch let out a sharp gasp of pain as we both went crashing to the hard concrete floor. The pistol skittered out of his grip, clattering away into the darkness. He was surprisingly strong, thrashing wildly and driving an elbow into my ribs that stole the breath from my lungs. I scrambled over him, pinning his shoulders to the ground. I brought the heavy steel pommel of my hunting knife down in a brutal arc, striking him squarely on the temple. Finch went limp instantly, his head hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The bunker was dead silent once more. Save for the ragged sound of my own hyperventilation, I sat there in the pitch black for what felt like an eternity, the reality of what had just happened washing over me in freezing waves. I had just fought off my grandfather's ruthless business partner in a classified, subterranean vault. I patted down my pockets, retrieved my phone, and turned on the flashlight app. The meager LED light cast long, dancing shadows across the room. Finch was unconscious, a thin trickle of blood weeping from his temple. I quickly found the discarded Heckler & Koch, checked the safety, and shoved it into my waistband. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. I walked over to the shattered breaker box. The main switch had tripped when the mag light smashed the panel, but the wiring was largely intact. Using the rubber handle of my knife, I forced the heavy switch back into the on position. The generator roared back to life deep within the mountain. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, buzzed, and finally bathed the bunker in harsh, sterile white light. I zip-tied Finch's hands and ankles, using a bundle of heavy-duty electrical ties I found in a supply cabinet. He was breathing steadily, but he wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. With the immediate threat neutralized, I turned my attention back to the room. Finch had lied about almost everything, but he was right about one thing. This place was the beating heart of the Hargrove Empire. I walked behind the teak desk and began opening the filing cabinets. The sheer volume of incriminatory data was staggering. There were folders detailing bribes paid to defense contractors at Lockheed Martin, blueprints for off-the-books rendition black sites, financial records showing billions of dollars funneled through shell companies in Geneva and the Cayman Islands. It was a complete, unredacted history of global corruption spanning 40 years. But why did Thomas send me here? If Finch was planning to kill me and steal the money, why did my grandfather give me the key? Thomas Hargrove never made a mistake. He didn't just stumble into death. He calculated it. I sat down in my grandfather's heavy leather chair. I looked at the desk, the ledger, the rotary phone, the half-empty ceramic mug. Wait, the mug. If Finch had only been here to ambush me, why would he make a cup of coffee? Furthermore, the coffee was still warm when I arrived. Finch had been in Seattle at the will reading just 4 hours ago. He couldn't have beaten me here by enough time to brew a fresh pot, set an ambush, and casually sip coffee. I touched the mug again. I looked at the dark liquid inside. I picked it up and poured the coffee onto the floor. A heavy, waterproof USB drive clattered onto the teak wood. My heart skipped a beat. I wiped the drive clean and plugged it into a bulky, modernized laptop sitting beneath the teleprinter. The screen flickered to life, requiring a password. The key turns counterclockwise, twice. I thought about the note in the wooden box. I typed in the exact coordinates of the bunker. 46.2754123.9871. The computer chimed, and a single video file appeared on the desktop. It was titled, "For Daniel." I clicked play. The screen filled with the harsh, angular face of my grandfather, General Thomas Hargrove. He looked incredibly frail, oxygen tubes running beneath his nose, sitting in his study at the Bellevue estate. The timestamp indicated this was recorded just 3 days before his death. "Daniel," his gruff voice echoed through the laptop speakers. "If you are watching this, it means you survived the encounter with Gregory. I apologize for the theatrics and the danger, but I needed a crucible. I needed to know you had the iron required to take my place." I stared at the screen, utterly paralyzed. He knew Finch was going to betray him. He used me as bait. Gregory has been stealing from the reserve funds for a decade. The video version of my grandfather continued calmly. He thought I was too old to notice. He thought he could consolidate power, take the 45 million, and frame you. But I knew you, Daniel. You have your mother's intellect, and deep down, my ruthlessness. You proved that today. The old man leaned closer to the camera, his eyes burning with a fierce, unapologetic intensity. Beatrice and Leo are weak. They think money is just a number on a screen. They don't understand that true wealth is leverage. True power is knowing the secrets that can destroy nations. In this bunker, you hold the strings to politicians warlords and corporate titans. The USB drive currently in your machine contains a master algorithm. It links directly to the offshore accounts of everyone in the ledger. With one keystroke, you can drain their wealth or expose them to the Department of Justice. A cold, heavy realization settled into my stomach. My grandfather didn't just leave me an abandoned military bunker. He left me a loaded gun pointed at the most powerful people on Earth. Finch's accounts have already been frozen and redirected to a blind trust in your name, Thomas said, a ghost of a smile playing on his pale lips. The 45 million is yours, but the real inheritance is the network. You are the architect now, Daniel. Protect the bunker. Guide the world from the shadows. And never trust anyone. The video cut to black. I sat in the silence of the subterranean vault, listening to the steady hum of the generator. I looked down at the tied-up, bleeding body of Gregory Finch. I thought about Aunt Beatrice and Cousin Leo, sitting in their glass mansions, completely unaware that the foundation of their entire existence was now resting beneath my index finger. I could destroy it all. I could walk out of here, hand the drive to the FBI, and watch the global elite crumble. It would be the righteous thing to do, the moral thing. I slowly reached out, resting my hand on the heavy brass key. I looked at the massive blast doors, sealing me away from the rain, the noise, and the weakness of the world above. A strange, intoxicating calm washed over me. I wasn't just an architectural historian anymore. I was the warden of Sector 414. I pulled the laptop closer, cracked my knuckles, and began to read the first file. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you do if you inherited a billion-dollar blackmail bunker? Let me know down in the comments. Would you expose the truth or take the power for yourself? Don't forget to drop a like, share this video with your friends, and stay tuned for the next mystery.